No losses and everything is going according to plan are not new phrases in Russian propaganda. Both modern Russia and the Soviet Union have concealed the truth to avoid losing face, manipulating information and risking people's lives for the sake of a polished ideological image. The same happened after the largest nuclear disaster in the history of nuclear energy, the Chernobyl catastrophe on April 26, 1986. The radioactive cloud formed after the explosion of the fourth reactor at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant passed over the European part of the USSR, most of Europe, and even the eastern part of the United States. Belarus and Ukraine suffered the most from radiation. Ukrainians were among the first to feel the consequences of the radioactive release. Yet, instead of informing the public about the danger and taking protective measures, the Soviet authorities attempted to hide the truth, as admitting responsibility was not in their interest. Against this callous decision, the traditional May Day parade was held. Thousands of people, instead of being evacuated, receiving medical assistance, or following safety protocols, gathered in the center of the capital, only 130 kilometers from the epicenter of the accident. The reaction of the Soviet leadership in the first days after the accident. Although the population of the Chernobyl zone was being evacuated, the first official information about the disaster in the USSR appeared only on the evening of April 28 in the televised news program Vremya, and consisted of a short 15-second announcement. An accident has occurred at the Chernobyl nuclear power station. One of the nuclear reactors has been damaged. Measures are being taken to eliminate the consequences of the accident. Assistance is being provided to the victims. A government commission has been established. From April 26th to May 6th, the most intensive release of radioactive materials from the damaged reactor continued. Tens of millions of curies, a unit of radioactivity, per day. Specialists referred to this period as the active stage of the accident. At the same time, Soviet mass media insisted that the accident posed no danger to public health. On April 30th, the USSR's main newspaper, Pravda, published a short note claiming that the radiation situation at the power plant and surrounding area had been stabilized. An official warning about the danger of radiation exposure was issued only on May 5th, and advice on possible protective measures was published even later, on May 9th, in Pravda Ukraini. On May 14th, General Secretary of the CPSU Central Committee Mikhail Gorbachev gave a televised address that contained false and manipulative statements about the accident. For example, he claimed that the Soviet Union was facing such an emergency for the first time. In reality, there had already been smaller-scale accidents at Soviet nuclear power plants. 1975, Leningrad NPP, 1978-1979, Chernobyl MPP, and the KGB had repeatedly reported design and operational flaws. Gorbachev also asserted that citizens had been notified promptly and accused Western countries of launching anti-Soviet campaigns aimed at undermining trust in socialist states. The Soviet government went to great lengths to conceal information about the nuclear catastrophe, endangering the world in order to preserve the illusion of prosperity. Already on April 27th, a classified report by Vasyl Limonov, head of the KGB department in Kyiv, appeared emphasizing intensified efforts to prevent panic and provocative rumors related to the accident. On May 1st, he reported having discovered leaflets in Kyiv containing tendentious fabrications about the consequences of the Chernobyl accident and slanderous attacks against Soviet leaders, and that searches for those who distributed them had begun. Instead of focusing on public safety, the authorities wasted time fighting imaginary enemies. The KGB also monitored and pressured foreigners in the USSR. Officers held educational talks with them and prevented them from leaving the country, fearing they would reveal information about the disaster abroad. There were also conspiracy theories blaming imperialist states. A report by Stepan Muha, head of the Ukrainian KGB to the Communist Party, claimed that the United States was using Ukrainian emigre organizations in an anti-Soviet campaign connected to the accident. In reality, Ukrainians in the United States and Canada organized protests and advocacy campaigns to draw attention to the disaster and the need for improved nuclear safety. Thus, the Soviet regime treated any truth about the horrific consequences of Chernobyl,
both domestically and internationally, as slander and an attempt to discredit the USSR.
Debates about holding mass events in Ukraine. Each year on May 1 to 2, the Soviet Union celebrated one of its most important propaganda holidays, International Workers' Day. While the holiday originated in 1886 after workers' protests in Chicago, in the USSR, it became a tool for promoting communist ideology. Instead of focusing on workers' rights, the holiday featured slogans about disarmament, even as the USSR devoted massive industrial resources to weapons and calls for a worldwide revolution. The main element of the celebration was mass demonstrations on May 1, involving nearly all citizens, workers, students, and even children. After the Chernobyl disaster, the question arose whether the traditional May Day demonstration should be held. Discussions continued almost until the very start of the event. The Chernobyl NPP was subordinated to Moscow, so Gorbachev was the first to receive news of the accident, followed by Vladimir Sherbitsky, first secretary of the Communist Party of Ukraine. Moscow insisted the demonstration proceed. Kyiv opposed it. Kyiv's main argument was that Khreshchatyk Street lay in a lowland area where radioactive particles could accumulate. Gorbachev, however, was more concerned that canceling the event might spark a panic. On April 29, Stepan Muka reported to Moscow. Information received by the KGB of the Ukrainian SSR indicates that preparations for the May 1 celebration are taking place in a healthy political atmosphere in the Republic, in an environment of high socio-political and labor activity of the working people in fulfilling the historic decisions of the 27th CPSU Congress. On April 30th, the Ukrainian Communist Party held a meeting. At 1800, they approved the May Day demonstration, citing radiation readings at 1500 that appeared normal, as the radioactive cloud had moved toward Belarus. But that evening, the wind changed direction toward Kyiv, and radiation levels began rising sharply. A KGB report noted, according to the Republican Hydrometeorological Service, air mass movement from the accident area caused an increase in natural background radiation in Kyiv on May 1, 1986, to 550 to 1200 microrodentgens per hour. Nevertheless, the decision was not reversed, and later Ukrainian officials justified their actions by claiming pressure from Moscow.
The May Day demonstration in Kyiv. On May 1, 1986, at 10 a.m., the demonstration began on Khreshchatyk and the square of the October Revolution, now Independence Square. Radiation levels at the time exceeded the norm by more than 500 times. Leading the procession were young people in traditional Ukrainian costumes, behind them, children. A later KGB report from May 8th stated, during preparations for the May 1st demonstration, school children were issued rehearsal costumes, which they wore on April 27th, 28th, and 29th. From May 5th to 8th, these costumes were returned to schools. The clothing shows a high level of radiation contamination. Smiling Kyiv residents marched under a radioactive cloud with banners, portraits of Soviet leaders, and red flags shouting familiar slogans: Peace, Labor, May. Workers of the world, unite. Energy of ideas into energy of action. No to war. The newspaper of Vecherny Kyiv reported on May 2nd that more than 120,000 residents and visitors participated. Demonstrations were also held in Kharkiv, Donetsk, Lviv, and other cities and towns across the USSR. On the honorary viewing platform stood ministry leaders, Supreme Soviet deputies,
and high-ranking officials. Moscow required them to bring their families to demonstrate that there was no reason to worry. Valentina Shevchenko, head of the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet of Ukraine, later recalled, "During the demonstration, both my son and my pregnant daughter-in-law stood on the platform, as did all the leaders with their families. Although many people claimed that Ukrainian officials immediately flew their own children out of Kyiv. Also present were party veterans, World War II participants, leading workers, cultural figures, and scientists, all to show that May 1st, 1986 was like any other year. The only notable difference was the absence of energy sector workers who were busy fighting the fires in Pripyat. The demonstration lasted 1 hour and 20 minutes, much shorter than the usual 5, but it was enough for people to begin arriving at hospitals afterward with symptoms of radiation sickness. Declassified documents revealed that doctors were instructed to diagnose these symptoms as vegetative dystonia, covering up the true cause. Some medical specialists tried to speak out. The head of the Kyiv Regional Hospital warned that misinformation would disrupt proper treatment protocols, while the head of the hematology department received a reprimand for spreading panic. The May Day festivities of 1986 were the embodiment of Soviet irresponsibility, a government trying to hide the truth and failing to protect its citizens from radiation.
Consequences and historical significance. Mikhail Gorbachev later admitted that the Chernobyl disaster accelerated the collapse of the Soviet Union. A huge number of human and material resources were required for the cleanup. In 1986 to 1989, damages and expenses amounted to 9.2 billion rubles, about 12.6 billion USD, and in 1990 alone, 4.324 billion rubles. The USSR could no longer fully use the contaminated Chernobyl zone, which held factories, equipment, machinery, and the destroyed reactor, all rendered unusable. These economic burdens made the arms race with the United States increasingly difficult, undermining the ideology of state militarism, a core pillar of Soviet identity. The USSR made many mistakes in responding to the disaster, particularly in openly concealing information about its scale. This eroded citizens' trust in the government and raised questions about nuclear safety. Chernobyl also fueled protest movements in Soviet republics, especially Ukraine. Citizens demanded more freedom of speech, more governmental transparency, and more attention to environmental and safety issues. These sentiments helped shape national movements that later paved the way to independence. Thus, the Chernobyl disaster not only revealed the fragility of Soviet power, but also became a catalyst for social and political changes that ultimately contributed to the dissolution of the Soviet Union.